Welcome back to U.S. Command Intelligence. What happened in the Persian Gulf in the past 24 hours is not a military incident. It is not a provocation. It is not an escalation in the diplomatic sense that word is normally used. It is a detonation, a strategic detonation, whose shockwave is traveling through every energy market, every naval planning cell, and every government treasury on the planet simultaneously, and whose full implications the institutions responsible for preventing it are working around the clock to manage, minimize, and where possible, conceal from the public that elected them. 400 Khaibar-Shekan ballistic missiles, 8 Saudi supertankers, 1 operational window. The Persian Gulf, the body of water that the global economy has treated for 50 years as too strategically important to ever truly become a battlefield, became a battlefield last night. And the force that made it one did so with a precision, a scale, and a strategic intelligence that has left every assumption underlying the Gulf's maritime security architecture in the same condition as the 8 vessels currently burning on its surface, obliterated. Tonight, I'm going to deliver what the emergency press conferences and the carefully worded State Department statements will not, the complete, unfiltered strategic reality of what 400 missiles named for the conquest of an impenetrable fortress just did to the energy order that has organized global power since 1973. Before this analysis goes deeper, 4 questions are going to be answered in the next 40 minutes that no mainstream outlet is currently asking with the honesty they require. First, 400 ballistic missiles reached 8 supertankers simultaneously in a body of water patrolled by the United States Fifth Fleet. How? And what does that answer reveal about the true operational state of American naval deterrence in the Persian Gulf tonight? Second, the Khaibar-Shekan carries a name chosen with deliberate historical weight. What specifically makes this missile system a generational leap beyond everything that preceded it in Iran's arsenal? And why did 8 Saudi supertankers, protected by American Patriot batteries and the most expensive naval hardware Riyadh's petrodollars could purchase, have no meaningful defense against 400 of them? Third, Saudi Arabia has spent over $1 trillion on American military hardware across 3 decades of procurement, Patriot batteries, THAAD systems, F-15 squadrons, naval corvettes. How did that investment, the most expensive bilateral defense relationship in the history of American arms exports, fail so completely and so visibly in the single moment it was most needed? And fourth, OPEC's shattering is not an energy story. It is a geopolitical earthquake whose aftershocks will reshape the relationship between the petrodollar system, American global financial dominance, and the emerging multipolar order that China and Russia have been patiently positioning to lead for years. What comes after OPEC collapses, and who is already prepared for exactly this moment? If you are watching this channel because you understand that the truth about what is happening in the Persian Gulf tonight is too important to leave to the institutions that failed to prevent it, hit like, subscribe, and drop your perspective in the comments below. Tell us what you think the obliteration of 8 Saudi supertankers means for the future of global energy and American power in the Gulf. Every comment sharpens the picture. To understand the operational reality of what 400 Khaibar-Shekan missiles did to 8 Saudi supertankers in the Persian Gulf, you must first discard every mental model of ballistic missile warfare built on the engagements of previous decades, because what Iran executed last night does not resemble the missile operations that Western strategic imagination has modeled, wargamed, and prepared countermeasures against across 30 years of post-Cold War defense planning. It resembles something more sophisticated, more precisely calibrated, and more strategically consequential than anything the Persian Gulf has witnessed since the tanker war of the 1980s, and it dwarfs that conflict in both scale and strategic permanence. The 8 targeted vessels were not randomly selected from the transit traffic moving through Gulf shipping lanes. They were the product of weeks of Iranian maritime surveillance, a systematic intelligence preparation of the battlefield that mapped vessel movements, cargo manifests, transit schedules, insurance registry data, and real-time positional tracking across the entirety of Saudi Arabia's active supertanker fleet operating in Gulf waters. Iranian naval intelligence assets complemented by satellite imagery from partner nations and open source maritime tracking data that the commercial shipping industry makes freely available build a targeting picture of extraordinary granularity. The specific vessels selected shared a characteristic beyond their Saudi registry that made them the optimal target set for the strategic message Iran intended to transmit. Each was fully loaded, carrying between 2 and 3 million barrels of crude petroleum, transiting outbound toward the export terminals at Ras Tanura and Jaima, through which Saudi Arabia pumps its petroleum into the arteries of the global market. A fully loaded VLCC, very large crude carrier, is not simply a commercial vessel. It is a floating petroleum reservoir carrying cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars with ignition potential that transforms a successful missile strike from a hull damage event into a sustained industrial fire of extraordinary destructive intensity. Iranian targeting planners understood this physics with the precision of engineers who designed the warhead specifically for this engagement. The Khaibar-Shekan's penetrating warhead optimized for hull breach and cargo compartment penetration rather than the blast fragmentation design used against hardened land targets was selected to maximize the probability of cargo ignition on contact. When a penetrating warhead breaches the hull of a fully loaded VLCC and reaches the cargo spaces, the ignition of 2 to 3 million barrels of crude petroleum produces a fire that no maritime firefighting capability can approach, that burns for days, and that transmits a visual message visible from orbit to every government and every commercial shipping operator on the planet simultaneously. The engagement architecture reflected the same saturation logic that has defined Iranian missile doctrine across every operational domain in which it is being deployed. 400 Khaibar-Shekan missiles were not allocated in a simple arithmetic ratio across 8 targets. The allocation was operationally sophisticated, accounting for the specific defensive systems protecting each vessel, the proximity of American Fifth Fleet assets capable of generating intercept solutions, the trajectory geometry that would present the most challenging intercept problem to the Aegis combat systems of nearby destroyers, and the requirement to ensure destruction rather than damage across the complete target set within a single compressed operational window. Vessels operating in proximity to American naval assets received heavier missile allocations, enough to saturate the intercept capacity of the Aegis systems within range, while ensuring that sufficient warheads survived the defensive response to achieve the required damage. Vessels operating in reduced naval coverage zones received allocation size for efficiency, enough to guarantee the result without overcommitting inventory against targets whose defensive coverage was thinner. The launch execution was coordinated across multiple firing positions distributed throughout Iranian territory and along the Iranian coastline, a geographic dispersal designed to prevent any single counter-battery strike from disrupting the salvo, even in the hypothetical scenario where American or Saudi forces had detected the launch preparations with sufficient warning to attempt interdiction. The launch windows across the distributed firing positions were compressed and synchronized to minimize the time between first radar detection of the salvo and final impact, reducing the operational window available to defensive systems from minutes to seconds for each individual threat track, while simultaneously presenting those systems with hundreds of simultaneous inbound trajectories requiring independent engagement solutions. The American Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain and maintaining continuous patrol coverage across the Persian Gulf shipping lanes, detected the launches within seconds of the first missiles leaving their launch cells. What followed was the most intensive naval air defense engagement in the history of Fifth Fleet operations. Standard missiles fired at maximum rate, Aegis combat systems running simultaneous engagement solutions against hundreds of threat tracks, Patriot batteries protecting Saudi coastal infrastructure activated and engaging the highest priority threats within their coverage zones. Every defensive system performed its design function. The technology worked as advertised. The mathematics simply did not allow the combined defensive architecture to service the volume of simultaneous inbound threats that 400 Khaibar-Shekan missiles presented within the engagement timeline available in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf. When the defensive magazine is finite and the incoming salvo exceeds the throughput capacity of the combined intercept architecture, the residual threats reach their targets. Last night, the residual threats numbered enough to destroy 8 of the most valuable commercial vessels afloat, 8 simultaneous detonations, 8 simultaneous cargo ignitions, 8 supertankers transformed in a single operational window from commercial maritime assets into sustained petroleum fires, burning at temperatures that made approach impossible. At a scale visible from orbit across a stretch of Gulf shipping lanes, the commercial maritime traffic vacated completely within hours of the engagement. The fires are still burning. They will burn for days, and every hour they burn, the maritime intelligence picture they transmit becomes more definitive in the calculations of every shipping operator, every insurance underwriter, every cargo charterer, and petroleum trader on the planet. The Persian Gulf is no longer a reliably safe operating environment for commercial maritime traffic. The era in which Saudi petroleum exports could be treated as a physically secure component of global energy supply ended in 8 simultaneous fireballs that the entire world watched ignite in real time. The Khaibar-Shekan is not simply a missile, it is a declaration, a weapons system whose every technical characteristic reflects a deliberate Iranian strategic choice about what kind of power Iran intends to project, against what kind of targets, and with what message attached. To understand why 8 Saudi supertankers had no meaningful defense against 400 of them, you need to understand what makes the Khaibar-Shekan categorically different from the ballistic missile systems that preceded it, and why the Western defense establishment's public assessments of Iranian ballistic missile capability were so comprehensively wrong about what Iran was actually building. The Khaibar-Shekan entered public consciousness in February 2022 when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps unveiled it with the ceremonial weight that Iran reserves for weapons systems it considers generationally significant. The name was not chosen casually. Khaibar refers to a 7th century battle where a fortress believed impenetrable by its defenders fell to a siege whose historical memory has carried symbolic weight across 14 centuries of Islamic tradition. Iran named this missile the Conqueror of Fortresses, and last night it demonstrated that the fortress it was named to conquer is not medieval stone, but modern maritime security architecture. The technical characteristics that distinguish the Khaibar-Shekan from its predecessors in the Fateh and Zulfiqar families reflect 15 years of iterative Iranian ballistic missile development driven by one specific operational requirement: defeat the layered air defense systems that American military technology has deployed to protect its regional partners. Every technical decision embedded in the Khaibar-Shekan's design, its range, its guidance architecture, its terminal maneuver capability, its warhead selection was made in direct response to the specific capabilities and specific limitations of the Patriot and Aegis systems. It was designed to penetrate the range assessment. Placing the Khaibar-Shekan at approximately 1,400 kilometers is the first critical characteristic. Launch platforms positioned deep within Iranian strategic depth, far beyond the reach of any immediate counter-battery response, can engage targets throughout the entire Persian Gulf. The Red Sea approaches and significant portions of the broader regional geography. A weapon that is fired from a position that cannot be reached before its warhead arrives cannot be defeated by counter-battery action. It can only be defeated by intercept, and the Khaibar-Shekan was designed to defeat the intercept. The guidance system represents the most consequential technical advancement over previous Fateh family variants, and the advancement that made last night's anti-ship engagement operationally possible rather than theoretically interesting. The Khaibar-Shekan employs a multi-mode guidance architecture combining inertial navigation in the boost phase, GPS-independent terrain reference positioning in the mid-course phase, and a terminal active seeker capable of acquiring and tracking a moving maritime target in the final seconds of flight. That last capability, terminal active seeker guidance against a moving vessel, is the technical feature that transforms the Khaibar-Shekan from a land attack ballistic missile into a genuine anti-ship ballistic missile system. A supertanker moving at 15 knots presents a fundamentally different targeting problem than a fixed geographic coordinate. The Khaibar-Shekan's terminal seeker acquires the vessel's radar signature in the terminal phase, tracks it through the final seconds of flight, and guides the warhead to impact regardless of the vessel's movement during the missile's flight time. Saudi Patriot batteries defending against a ballistic missile threat expect to engage a target following a predictable terminal trajectory toward a fixed or slowly moving aim point. The Khaibar-Shekan's terminal maneuver capability incorporated specifically to defeat the engagement geometry assumptions built into Patriot intercept algorithms invalidated those assumptions in real time last night. The maneuverability in the terminal phase reflects Iranian access to Russian technical knowledge regarding ballistic missile defense intercept mathematics. Patriot and Aegis intercept solutions are calculated based on predicted terminal trajectories, mathematical projections of where an incoming ballistic missile will be at the moment of intercept based on its observed flight path. A missile that maneuvers in its terminal phase forces the intercept system to continuously recalculate its engagement solution in real time, compressing the computational window and degrading intercept probability with each maneuver cycle. Last night, 400 Khaibar-Shekans were maneuvering simultaneously, presenting the combined American and Saudi defensive architecture with a computational workload. It was not designed to service at that volume and tempo. Iran did not develop this capability in isolation. The technical lineage of the Khaibar-Shekan's guidance architecture reflects a development program that drew on Russian expertise in ballistic missile terminal guidance physics. Chinese signal processing technology accessed through channels that comprehensive sanctions have never fully closed, and the operational experience accumulated by Iranian engineers across years of testing against American systems operating in the Gulf region. The most important single technical input to the program, the foundation upon which Iran's understanding of American GPS receiver architecture was built, was a captured American RQ-170 Sentinel reconnaissance drone, recovered almost entirely intact in 2011 after Iranian electronic warfare teams guided it to a soft landing inside Iranian territory using GPS spoofing. What Iranian engineers extracted from that captured platform, the GPS receiver architecture, the signal authentication protocols, the navigation system logic that governed American military platforms, inform not only the electronic warfare programs that have subsequently blinded Israeli F-35s over the Middle East, but the GPS-independent guidance architecture that the Khaibar-Shekan uses, precisely because Iranian engineers understood, from direct examination of American systems, how GPS-dependent those systems were and designed their own weapons accordingly. The Khaibar-Shekan does not need GPS to find its target. It was built that way deliberately because the engineers who built it understood GPS dependency from the inside. Saudi Arabia deployed the best American-supplied defense it had available against 400 of these missiles last night. The Patriot Pack, 3 batteries protecting Saudi maritime infrastructure, performed their design function against the threats their intercept algorithms were designed to defeat. They were not designed to defeat the Khaibar-Shekan at this volume and this engagement geometry. The gap between what the Patriot was designed to intercept and what the Khaibar-Shekan was designed to penetrate is the product of 15 years of Iranian study of American missile defense architecture, 15 years of identifying every assumption embedded in American intercept doctrine and building a weapon that invalidates those assumptions one by one. The conqueror of Khaibar has earned its name. The fortress it conquered last night was not built from stone. It was built from the assumption that American-supplied missile defense technology would remain decisive against Iranian ballistic missiles indefinitely. 8 burning supertankers are the definitive answer to that assumption. The secure communications lines between Riyadh and Washington were active before the fires on the Persian Gulf had reached their full operational intensity. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that has anchored American strategic positioning in the Gulf for 8 consecutive decades, that has recycled its petroleum revenues through American financial markets in the Petrodollar arrangement, underpinning American global financial dominance since 1974, that has purchased more American military hardware than any other foreign customer in the history of American arms exports, was calling in the relationship that all of that history was supposed to guarantee was real. What Washington could offer in the immediate aftermath was genuine, professional, and insufficient real-time intelligence about the launch signatures detected by American early warning satellites, information that had arrived before the missiles impacted and had been transmitted to Saudi and American defensive systems with full urgency, to the operational effect that everyone involved could observe in the satellite imagery showing 8 simultaneous burn signatures across the Gulf shipping lanes. emergency consultations between CENTCOM and Saudi military leadership about what additional defensive augmentation could be deployed and on what timeline, diplomatic communications transmitted to Tehran through back channels, warnings of consequences, whose specific content the administration was still debating internally as the communications were being sent. State Department statements that solidarity with Saudi Arabia, carefully worded to Project Resolve, while avoiding the specific operational commitments that Resolve would require to be militarily meaningful. What Washington could not provide was the one thing that Riyadh needed in the hours following the engagement: a credible, honest answer to the question of how the American military presence that was explicitly supposed to prevent this outcome had failed to prevent it, and what had structurally changed that would prevent the next salvo from arriving with the same devastating precision and the same devastating effect. The honest answer being generated in classified Pentagon and NSC assessments, the answer that no official was prepared to state in any public forum, was that nothing fundamental had changed. The Fifth Fleet's combat capability was real and operational. The Aegis combat systems on American destroyers and cruisers had performed their design functions at maximum operational tempo. The Patriot batteries protecting Saudi maritime infrastructure had executed intercept attempts against the highest priority threat tracks within their engagement envelopes. All of these systems had done exactly what they were designed to do. The combined result of everything they were designed to do was insufficient to prevent 400 Khaibar-Shekan missiles from destroying 8 Saudi supertankers in a single operational window. This is not a failure that can be solved by sending more destroyers. The operational logic is mathematically unforgiving and institutionally embarrassing and cannot be managed through press conference, regardless of how carefully the press conference is scripted. The Khaibar-Shekan's combination of extended range firing positions, terminal maneuverability, defeating intercept algorithms, and salvo volume exceeding combined defensive throughput creates an engagement problem that no realistic American naval presence in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf can solve at the scale Iran demonstrated last night. Solving it permanently requires either a fundamental revolution in defensive intercept technology that does not yet exist at operational scale, or the destruction of Iran's Khaibar-Shekan production and storage infrastructure through sustained offensive strikes on Iranian territory. The offensive strike option is the destination that every American strategic planning session regarding Iranian escalation eventually reaches after exhausting every alternative, and the option that every such session then spends the majority of its analytical effort explaining why it cannot be executed without triggering a cascade of consequences that exceeds the costs it is designed to eliminate. A direct American military strike on Iranian missile infrastructure on Iranian sovereign territory is an act of war against the Iranian state. Iran's prepared response architecture for exactly this contingency includes the full activation of Hormuz denial operations that would eliminate Gulf petroleum transit entirely, direct strikes against American military installations across Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, and the broader region from assets pre-positioned for this specific retaliatory mission, the full operational activation of Hezbollah's strategic arsenal against Israeli population centers and military infrastructure, and the mobilization of Iranian-aligned forces across multiple countries against American personnel throughout the theater. The escalation cascade that direct American strikes on Iranian territory initiates is one that American strategic planning has consistently been unable to bound at a cost that American political institutions are willing to pay. This is not a failure of American military capability in the absolute sense. It is the expression of a genuine strategic constraint that Iran has spent decades deliberately constructing a retaliatory architecture calibrated to ensure that the cost of destroying Iranian missile capability exceeds the political and strategic palatability of the action required to destroy it. Iran calculated this constraint with precision before authorizing last night's engagement. The judgment made in Tehran that the combined American and Saudi defensive response would be insufficient to prevent the operational outcome, and that the American retaliatory response would be constrained by exactly the strategic logic outlined above, has been validated by every development in the hours since the last Khaibar-Shekan impacted. Washington is issuing statements, conducting consultations, repositioning naval assets for visibility, and doing none of the things that would actually change the strategic situation on the ground. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, repositioned to the northern Arabian Sea in the engagement's aftermath, represents the full visible expression of American deterrence theater in this moment. Its aircraft are flying. Its escorts are at combat-ready posture. The message its presence transmits, that American power is present, attentive, and capable, is being transmitted at full signal strength. Iran is receiving that signal with perfect clarity and has already calculated, with the confidence that comes from years of studying American strategic behavior under pressure, that the carrier strike group's presence in the northern Arabian Sea represents the ceiling rather than the floor of America's actual response. The Persian Gulf has been contested space across the entirety of recorded human civilization. The empires that have organized their power around its shores, Persian, Arab, Portuguese, British, American, have each built their relationship with this body of water on the premise that controlling its waters means controlling the strategic destiny of the broader world. Iran has never forgotten this history. It is embedded in the institutional consciousness of a civilization that traces its relationship with the Gulf across 25 centuries of continuous historical memory. Saudi Arabia, a kingdom whose modern political form dates to 1932, is learning the weight of that history tonight in the most expensive and most irreversible classroom available. Iran's decision to target Saudi petroleum infrastructure and Saudi maritime assets rather than American military targets directly reflects strategic intelligence of the highest order, the intelligence of an actor that has studied the system. It is fighting with far greater depth and patience than the system has studied it. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the American-led global order is not purely military. It is financial, institutional, and structural, built on the petrodollar architecture that has recycled Gulf petroleum revenues through American financial markets since the Nixon administration's 1974 arrangement with Riyadh established the foundational agreement that shaped the global financial system for the following 50 years. Attacking Saudi supertankers is not a military action in the narrow sense. It is a precision strike against the physical infrastructure that sustains the financial plumbing of American global dominance, the mechanism through which Gulf petroleum revenues have sustained demand for dollar-denominated assets, American treasury bonds, and American financial market instruments that underwrite American power projection globally. Iran understands this architecture with the precision of a nation that has spent 4 decades on the receiving end of that architecture's coercive weaponization. The Islamic Republic has been subjected to the full deployment of American financial power, excluded from dollar-denominated trade, severed from SWIFT, subjected to extraterritorial sanctions enforcement that has made doing business with Iran legally hazardous for financial institutions anywhere on the planet. Iran knows exactly how the petrodollar system works. It knows this because it has been studying the system that sanctions it for 4 decades with the focused analytical attention that only an adversary that is actively being damaged by a system and is actively seeking to undermine it can sustain. Attacking the physical infrastructure that sustains that system is the logical, strategically coherent response of an actor that cannot attack the system's financial mechanisms directly. 8 burning Saudi supertankers are the most direct available strike at the material foundation of the petrodollar arrangement, a demonstration that the physical security of Gulf petroleum exports, which the entire financial architecture assumes as a baseline condition, can be denied on Iran's operational timeline. The will that produced this strategic vision that sustained across 4 decades the institutional determination, the technical investment, the organizational patience required to build the Khaibar-Shekan program and deploy it in the manner demonstrated last night cannot be understood through rational actor frameworks that model strategic behavior as primarily responsive to external cost-benefit calculations. Iran is not primarily responsive to the incentive structures and cost impositions that the American-led order has deployed against it. It is driven by something that the Western strategic community's analytical models consistently fail to adequately weight: a combination of genuine national conviction, civilizational historical memory, and the accumulated institutional determination of an establishment that has been tested by everything the opposing side could deploy across 4 decades and has emerged from each test with its strategic commitment strengthened rather than eroded. The Revolutionary Guard Corps officers who planned and authorized last night's engagement are not adventurers or ideological maximalists operating outside rational constraint. They are strategic professionals formed by an institution that has been at war kinetically, economically, covertly, diplomatically for the entirety of their professional lives. They have absorbed the assassination of colleagues by foreign intelligence services. They have continued developing weapons programs through cyber attacks that disrupted industrial facilities. They have maintained strategic trajectories through sanctions that impoverish the broader national economy. The output of that sustained pressure is not capitulation or strategic retreat. It is the operational capability demonstrated last night, refined, precise, and executed with the institutional confidence of an organization that is being tested by maximum external pressure and has learned exactly where the limits of that pressure lie. Saudi Arabia's response reveals a fundamentally different institutional psychology, one shaped by purchased security rather than built security, by the assumption of guaranteed protection rather than the cultivation of indigenous strategic resilience. The kingdom has invested enormous sums in the American military relationship across 3 decades, not merely purchasing hardware, but purchasing the assumption that American deterrence credibility would translate into physical security guarantees of sufficient reliability to make developing an indigenous strategic depth unnecessary. When the guarantee failed last night, the institutional response was not the activation of a sovereign strategic capability, because that capability was never built. It was a call to the guarantor asking what happened and what comes next. The answer to what comes next is one that Riyadh's strategic establishment is processing with an urgency that will reshape Saudi foreign policy orientation across the coming decade in ways whose full implications are not yet visible, but whose direction is already determinable. Beijing's offer of a different kind of regional relationship built on economic partnership, diplomatic engagement, and the demonstrated ability to maintain productive relationships with Tehran, that Washington's bilateral commitments structurally prevent looks different from Riyadh's perspective after last night than it looked 48 hours ago. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was founded in Baghdad in September 1960 by 5 nations with a shared foundational purpose: coordinate petroleum production policy, manage global oil prices, and resist the pricing power of the major Western oil companies that had previously organized global petroleum economics on terms that systematically disadvantaged the producing nations. In the 65 years since that founding meeting, OPEC has survived wars between its own member states, revolutions that transformed the political character of its founding members, the rise of non-OPEC producers that progressively diluted its market share, and the repeated geopolitical crises that have periodically disrupted Gulf petroleum flows. It survived all of these because the foundational premise of its operation, that member states can coordinate production decisions with confidence that their petroleum will reach global markets through the maritime infrastructure of the Persian Gulf, remained intact. That premise did not survive last night. 8 Saudi supertankers burning simultaneously in the Gulf shipping lanes is not an incident that OPEC's institutional framework can absorb without fundamental consequence. It is the operational demonstration that the physical security of Gulf petroleum exports, the baseline condition upon which OPEC's entire coordinating function depends, can be denied by Iran on Iran's operational timeline. An organization built to manage the economics of petroleum exports cannot continue functioning as a coherent coordinating body when the physical security of those exports has been demonstrated to be contingent on Iranian restraint rather than American deterrence. The institutional collapse of OPEC is not a single dramatic event visible in a single press communique. It is a process accelerating in real time as the implications of last night's engagement propagate through the decision-making of every member state. But the process has reached a point of irreversibility that makes OPEC's effective functioning as a coordinated production cartel operationally impossible, regardless of what emergency ministerial statements its secretariat issues or what extraordinary session its member states convene. Saudi Arabia, OPEC's largest producer and the organizational anchor whose production decisions effectively set cartel policy, cannot coordinate production targets with the confidence that its output will reach global markets. When Iran has demonstrated the will and the operational capability to destroy its supertanker fleet at a timing and scale of Iran's choosing, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iraq face identical strategic calculations. The confidence that OPEC's coordinating function requires has been destroyed more completely by 400 missiles than by anything that has happened to the organization across 65 years of geopolitical turbulence. The immediate market consequences are already propagating through every commodity trading center simultaneously, with a velocity that outpaces any institutional response. Oil prices breaking through levels that futures markets had assigned near zero probability are generating margin calls, triggering stop-loss liquidations, and producing the kind of cascading financial dynamics that occur when a commodity, whose price underpins the financial assumptions of entire industry sectors, moves beyond the range that hedging structures were designed to accommodate. Energy companies, airlines, shipping operators, petrochemical manufacturers, every sector whose cost structure incorporates petroleum price assumptions is recalculating simultaneously. The strategic consequences operate on a longer time frame, but at far greater structural depth. The petrodollar system, the arrangement through which Gulf petroleum revenues are recycled through American financial markets, creating sustained structural demand for dollar-denominated assets that has underwritten American financial hegemony since 1974, depends on the reliable physical flow of Gulf petroleum exports that OPEC coordinates. A disruption of sufficient duration to force structural changes in how Gulf petroleum revenues are managed toward yuan-denominated settlements with Chinese trading partners, toward alternative reserve currency arrangements, toward the de-dollarization frameworks that China and Russia have been working to facilitate and institutionalize for years, represents a blow to American global financial power whose magnitude exceeds any military defeat in the entire history of American strategic competition. China's positioning in the immediate aftermath of last night's engagement is the single most strategically consequential development for the long-term global order, and the development that Washington is watching with the most acute institutional anxiety. Beijing is simultaneously the world's largest petroleum importer, deeply affected by any sustained disruption to Gulf supply, and the power best positioned to broker the framework that resolves the crisis on terms that advance Chinese strategic interests at the expense of American ones. The offer of Chinese mediation, framed as a responsible global stakeholder, stepping into the diplomatic vacuum created by American strategic failure to protect its Gulf partners, will be presented in Gulf capitals in the coming days with a weight and a credibility that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. If China brokers the framework that restores Gulf petroleum flows requiring Iranian restraint in exchange for formal recognition of Iranian strategic interests that the American-led order has systematically refused to acknowledge across 4 decades of confrontation, the strategic dividend for Beijing compounds across every dimension, simultaneously and persistently. Gulf states' security relationships reorient toward Chinese frameworks. Petroleum pricing arrangements emerging from the crisis resolution incorporate yuan denomination structures. The American financial architecture that depends on petrodollar recycling faces the structural erosion whose prevention has been a foundational objective of American Gulf policy since 1974. Russia benefits from every hour that Gulf petroleum flows remain disrupted without requiring a single Russian action to generate that benefit. Elevated energy prices flowing from supply disruption translate directly into Russian state revenues that sustain Russian strategic priorities across every theater of active Russian interest. American strategic attention and diplomatic resources consumed by the Gulf crisis are attention and resources unavailable for the theaters where Russian interests are most directly implicated, and the operational demonstration that American deterrence architecture in the Gulf cannot guarantee the security of its most critical partners validates the strategic narrative that Russia has been advancing in every multilateral forum for a decade, that American security guarantees are less reliable than the credibility of American rhetoric suggests. The global energy transition that has been proceeding alongside this geopolitical crisis acquires new strategic urgency in the aftermath of last night's engagement. Every government that has been managing the domestic political difficulty of accelerating the transition away from petroleum dependence now operates in a political environment where the national security arguments for that acceleration have been made with an empirical force that no policy document could replicate. The vulnerability of petroleum-dependent economies to Gulf supply disruptions, theoretically understood for decades, consistently deprioritized against the political difficulty of the transition, has been demonstrated operationally at a scale that permanently alters the domestic political calculus of every energy importing government on the planet. The world emerging from the Persian Gulf inferno burning on satellite imagery tonight is not a world that returns to the arrangements preceding the engagement through any available diplomatic or military mechanism. OPEC cannot be restored by ministerial communiques. The petrodollar system cannot be repaired by Federal Reserve statements or Treasury Department interventions. The American deterrence architecture in the Gulf cannot recover its operational credibility through carrier strike group repositioning or emergency defense consultations. These are not temporary disruptions to a fundamentally stable system awaiting restoration. They are the visible, burning, satellite-documented expressions of a structural transformation in the global order that has been building across decades and that last night's engagement has accelerated beyond the threshold of managed, gradual, controlled transition. The multipolar world is not a theoretical construct being debated in academic journals and think tank white papers. It has arrived. Its arrival was announced by 400 missiles named for the conquest of an impenetrable fortress, destroying 8 vessels that were supposed to be protected by the most powerful bilateral military relationship in the history of American arms exports. The fortress has fallen, the fires are burning across the Gulf, and the order that the fortress was built to protect is shattering in real time, along with OPEC, along with the petrodollar architecture, along with the assumption of American deterrence credibility that organized Gulf security for 50 years. Iran did this. It did it with patience. It did it with strategic discipline. It did it with weapons built under sanctions, tested against adversaries who insisted those weapons could not be built and deployed at the moment and against the target set that produced a maximum possible strategic effect. The Khaibar-Shekan has shattered more than 8 supertankers. It has shattered the foundational assumption of a global order. 8 supertankers are still burning in the Persian Gulf. OPEC is fragmenting in real time as every member state individually concludes that the coordinating premise of the organization has been destroyed more comprehensively than any previous crisis in its 65-year history. Washington is operating at the outer boundary of its strategic freedom in a theater where its adversary has constructed the engagement environment with 15 years of patient, disciplined, precisely targeted strategic investment that the Western analytical community consistently dismissed, consistently underestimated, and consistently failed to prepare adequate countermeasures against. And in Tehran, the strategic architects of a vision that sanctions assassinations, cyber attacks, and 4 decades of Western dismissal collectively failed to extinguish are watching the world process the consequences of 400 missiles named for the conquest of the unconquerable. The Khaibar-Shekan has earned its name in the fires of 8 burning supertankers. The question the world must now answer in Washington and Beijing and Riyadh, in every capital whose economic assumptions are burning alongside those vessels, is not whether the old order can be restored. It cannot. The question is what order replaces it, who shapes the replacement, and whether the transition from the order that burned last night to the order that emerges from those flames can be navigated without the kind of escalatory miscalculation that the fragility of this moment makes genuinely catastrophically possible. The fires on the Gulf are the punctuation mark at the end of an era. What comes next has not yet been written, but the actors who will write it, with patience, with strategic discipline, with the willingness to build capabilities that their adversaries insisted could never exist, have already identified themselves. What do you think replaces OPEC, a Chinese-mediated energy framework, an accelerated global transition away from Gulf petroleum, or something no current model has captured? And can Washington find a response to Iranian strategic capability that its own political constraints have not already foreclosed? Drop your most detailed analysis in the comments. The conversation happening below this video is the most strategically important one on this platform right now. If this analysis delivered the unfiltered strategic reality that the managed mainstream narrative refuses to provide, share it immediately. Hit like and subscribe to stay inside the most rigorous geopolitical analysis available anywhere on this platform. The next development in this crisis is already unfolding. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.